Alright, welcome to the third lesson in Module 3 of the Ultimate ZBrush Guide course. We're moving quite fast and we've accruing a lot of knowledge and a lot of information to process, but again, take everything step by step and you'll be able to absorb all. I'm sure of that. So in this video, I'm gonna do a kind of like a recap of some of the tools that we've been using and introduce you to something new, which are the clip brushes, the trim brushes, and the slide brushes. So I'm gonna show you the difference between those brushes and as well when and how to use them and why it's sometimes better to use one over the other, because the process and what they do, they're relatively similar in a way. So I want to clarify how they work and all that. So let's go ahead and jump straight into the full screen mode here. And this is what we did in the previous video. So just as a quick recap, we created the t-shirt and the two pieces here for the skirt, right? It looks like we didn't move forward too much, but we spent a lot of time defining, going a little bit more deep into what the extract function is and all that. So it's important to get that out of the way first. All right, so in this video, we're gonna create the pants for the character. So something like this, some nice baggy pants. Here in the concept, you can barely see them. I'm just gonna fill them in so that you can see what I'm referring to. So the pants for the character, that's what we're going to be doing in this video, as well as this area right here, okay, which is basically a flat polygon, so very similar to this mesh that we created in the previous video, but this is going to be just a placeholder that we can use to then put all of these smaller details, which is, you know, another process in ZBrush that we need to learn. So really just a couple of things, the pants and this part. Let me just close this one off. Actually, let's get rid of that, close that, and let's start by doing the same thing that we usually do. So let's go to the preference palette, config palette, and I'm gonna load the UI for this lesson. So the UI is this one, clip trim slice M03_L03, so lesson 3. I'm going to open this one up and just very briefly show you the new elements that I have added. So I added these two buttons here in the space that we had next to the Dynamesh button. And these are a couple of buttons that are going to be very, very useful for you. And especially the delete hidden, I believe, is one of the mostly widely used features in ZBrush to delete certain portions of the mesh. So we're going to be getting into that as well. And here we have the new brushes that I just added. So we have the clip curve, the slice curve, and the trim curve. All right. So I put it in this area just because the way that you access these brushes is the same way that you access the selection brushes. So Control plus Shift. Now within these brushes, there are a few more. So there are more clipping brushes, more slice brushes, and more trim brushes. But these ones are I think the most complicated ones in a way, although they're pretty simple, but out of all of them, they're the most complicated ones. So once you learn these ones, you can just run with the other ones. All right, so let's go ahead and clear this up. So those are the new elements of the UI. And let's start by creating the pants, because that's going to be kind of like the recap and the introduction to the brushes. So the same way that we did with the previous video or with the previous series of assets, I'm going to utilize the body. I'm going to go into solo mode as well, as my base mesh so that I can produce the next set of meshes or the pants. Now you can use the extract function for this process. You're totally fine to do that. However, like I said, I want to bit by bit introduce you to all the different features in ZBrush and all the tools that you can use. So for instance, if you had let's say a pant here for this guy that are kind of like these 70s or 80s type of pants, that I end up with kind of like in this bell shape here. So this is going to be open like these areas here. These are arrows, by the way. Right, so in this case you can use the extract function, because if you look at it from this angle, right, what you end up with is something like that, right? And the leg would be in the middle. So this will be empty, and it makes sense to have like a thin version. So similar to what we did with the shirt. However, in this new process that I'm going to show you, which is pretty similar, and again, it's a recap of what we've been doing, we're going to use something different. So the type of pants that I created for this character are kind of like these baggy pants that get compressed and tied here towards the, below the knee. right? So because of this, and this is also to introduce you to this way of thinking in terms of workflow that will hopefully help you decide which method of which process in ZBrush is better depending on what asset or what part of the character you're working on. So in this case, right, this is going to be pretty tight, so there's not going to be gap between one and the other, so there's not going to be any thin or thick areas. You won't be able to see the difference, and this top area as well is going to be covered by the thick belt anyway, right? So in this case, the pants, they could be they can totally be a thin mesh, like I said, but it's much easier to work with a full mesh. So this is going to be a Dynamesh, this whole thing. All right, now the thing here is that we're going to use this base mesh as our starting point to create these pants. So I'm going to show you a different method. I'm going to go ahead and first duplicate this mesh, because obviously I don't want to do the changes or clip or do anything in the actual body, because that's the one that we're using for the body. So I'm going to duplicate it, and now we have two bodies, exactly the same thing. And in this one, I'm going to go ahead and use the trim curve. So I'm going to click on the trim curve, select that, and I'm going to hold the Control and Shift key on my keyboard, and you'll see now I have that selected just by holding Control and Shift. And I'm going to go ahead and hold Control, click and drag and slice. Okay, when I let go, ZBrush is going to basically clip. I'm going to turn off the line so that you can see the different colors of the polygroups. ZBrush is basically trimming that mesh, right? And I can keep slicing. Now, what's important about these trim brushes and clip brushes and all of that, they all work in the same way, as in they have the same behavior. They all have a wide line, right? When you start, let's say this is point A when you click, and this is when you let go, point B. And that is the kind of like the center line. And then you'll see there's going to be kind of like a shaded side to these clip brushes. Okay, so it's kind of like a drop shadow from the line. So anything that is in this side is going to be clipped. Okay, so if you don't want to, let's say if you want to clip this other side, you need to start the point A. You need to start clicking here and then slice it up. Okay, so I'll show you just in a practical example so it makes sense. And also another thing that you notice is that although I have symmetry enabled, this brush or these brushes, they don't work with symmetry. So you have to use the mirror and weld operation later on. Okay, and that's why this is a kind of like a good recap of all of the process that we've been working on. So if I also want to trim this arm, if I hold Control, click, and drag, and you'll notice this is the shaded line that I was talking about, and ZBrush is going to snap to every, I believe it's every 5 degrees. It snaps as you move the line, right? And that is because I'm holding the Control and Shift key at the same time, right? So if I let go now, ZBrush is going to actually trim everything, or the rest of the body, right? Because the shaded part of that line was towards the right. So let me undo that. So what I was saying before is that if you want to trim this side, instead of starting from the top and the bottom to do this, undo, you start from the bottom. So Control, click, and Shift, and now the shaded part is on the other side. So we can trim that like so. Now, there are a few other tools or functions for these brushes that are pretty useful. So for example, if I hold Control and Shift, click and drag, right? Now I'm gonna let go of the Control and Shift. So we have, it's not snapping anymore, right? But let's say that I don't wanna do this anymore. I don't wanna trim this side of the arm. I wanna do the other one. I can hold the space bar and reposition my entire line. And I can go to this side and maybe let go of the spacebar, rotate around, press the spacebar, and reposition that line. Okay, so that's something really, really helpful, really useful. So again, just Control and Shift to access that trim brush, and the spacebar to reposition the line. And that's going to be the same behavior for the slice and the clip brush when we get to it. All right. So another very cool thing about this brush is that you can actually create a curve, right? That's why the name of the curve. So far, if I press Control and Shift and I click and drag, is basically a straight line. So the way that you create a curve, let's just trim this bit, and I want to trim this area. So click Control and Shift, right? but I wanna curve around this area. So wherever your cursor is, if you press the Alt key once, 0 is gonna create a point in the curve, right? So you can just move around, and it's kind of like a Bezier curve. So you can do the same thing again, press Alt, and it's gonna create this curve. So anything that is within that shaded line is going to be clipped. So it doesn't have to be a straight line. It could be, something a bit more curvy, right? Another cool thing is that you can trim with a very sharp edge. So this is something that is very useful for hard surface modeling, for example, just to clip parts of the mesh. So you can hold Control and Shift, click and drag, and instead of pressing the Alt button once, I'm gonna press it twice. So double tapping the Alt key, and that creates a sharp point. Okay, it's almost like creating 2 points in the curve in the same place. So that's why it becomes a sharp point. And now I can let go, and it creates this more sharp edge. All right, so this brings me to my next point, which is, hopefully you can see this, that this trim curve, which is really cool, cuts through the model, but then it creates an average between the empty space that is clipping to add more polygons, or to add the rest of the mesh, right? So it's not a straight and clean cut. It is if you are doing something like this, right? That is very, a straight line. But as soon as you start generating a little bit of curvature, you can end up with a bit of volume in between that is not ideal, or at least not in this process. So for instance, if I select the clip curvature, or the clip curve brush, go ahead and click on that, hold Control and Shift to access it, and I'm going to repeat the same thing. Now, before I go any further, this brush actually works with symmetry, so I'm going to turn off symmetry. So I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to hold Control and Shift, and then I'm going to tap Alt once to create a bit of a curvature, and I can press the spacebar to reposition this, and I can go ahead and let's do it around here, and you'll see why in a second. Let go, and now this gives me a perfect line, or perfect clipping of this mesh based on that line. So this is great, right? Now, if I get a bit closer, or move things around, you might see there is a new issue. And that's why it's important to get the knowledge of these brushes out of the way first. And you might see that issue in here. It creates this very thin border, right? And the problem, or the reason why this is happening, is because the clipping brush is actually not removing or trimming anything. So the trim curve, it actually deletes the mesh, whereas the clipping is just basically push all the polygons towards the curve. Okay, so for instance, let me just do an example here. Actually, let's do it with a sphere. Here we have the mesh that I used in the previous video, and I'm going to explain the use of this, or the difference between these brushes. So the trim curve, if I hold Control, Shift, click and drag, this is the trim brush. It just does a straight cut, and that's perfectly fine. And I'm going to use the clip brush in here, Control, Shift, click and drag, right? So for the most part, this does exactly the same thing, right, from this angle. However, if we turn on the line for our polyframe, and we get a little bit closer, let's see what the clip did versus the trim. So the trim actually deleted polygons, right? So it removed everything that was in this part of the sphere, and it just filled in that gap that it was created with new geometry. That's why you see all these triangles. So it's very similar to the, kind of like a Dynamesh in a way, okay? So it just removes that and then fills in those gaps. Now, with the clip brush, you'll see that the topology of the sphere is basically untouched, is not being destroyed in a way, because all that this brush is doing is taking whatever mesh was in here, whatever volume was in here, and is flattening those points all the way down, right? So you end up with this flat area. It's just that's what basically the clip brush does, right? It doesn't remove the topology, it doesn't delete any polygons, it just flattens things out. So this one is really useful if you already have a decent topology that you can work with. So with the clip brush, you can go ahead and keep doing this. And I use this a lot for creating some stylized rocks and that sort of thing, because it's not destroying the mesh, it's just basically clipping these areas. All right, so let me just undo all this, because this becomes a problem when the clipped area is larger than the rest of the volume that is being clipped to. So let me give you a quick example of that. Let's assume that this area here, the distance is, I don't know, value of 10, right? And then we have another line maybe around here, which is a value of 12, right? And then we have another one here, which, it's almost 10. Let's say it's 9. Now we use the clip brush and we clip here with the shaded line this way, right? So we're just going to take anything that is on this side of the shaded line, and it's going to clip it, or it's going to move it towards this line, right? The clipping line. So because this value is less than this one, right, we're going to have enough geometry to receive, in a way, those clipping vertices, right? So all of this is going to be clipped this way, and it's going to be fine, right? But if we do the same thing in this line, so if we clip here with the shaded line here at the bottom, right, anything that is on this side is going to be clipped towards this line. So what happens now is that this line that is slightly larger or bigger, right, everything is going to be clipped, right? But all these points, or like the gap or the difference between the size, this size and the other one, this little gap here and this little gap here, ZBrush is not going to find any mesh to clip to, right? So it's just empty space. So what ZBrush is going to do is resolve it by simply flattening those pieces in here. And this becomes a problem. So let's do a quick example of that. I'm going to use the clip brush. So the first one is going to be the simple one, or the one that works, or the one that won't affect anything because it's clipping a smaller portion, right? So that clips all that, perfect. Looks all good. Now, if I do the same thing, but let's say here, right? It clips, and from this angle that I don't have perspective on, looks fine. But when I rotate, you'll see we have these flat polygons. And this is really bad in terms of overlapping vertices. So in terms of workflow, I would avoid this at all costs. So that's why you have to decide which ones and at what point is better to use one over the other. Just to do a quick summary, the clip brush or the clip curve brush is the one that allows you to clip everything and you can have a perfect curve. So let me undo that. So you can have a perfect curve in this way, right? Which is nice. The caveat or the issue is that if you clip in an area that is larger than the area that you're clipping to, then you become an issue. So if I clip it here, everything that was in this side would clip to this line, and we end up with this very weird flat polygon, which is not good. Okay, so in that case, instead of clipping, I would use the trim brush, right? I will get rid of that point, and now we have a clean mesh. That is the main difference. That's the main difference between the trim and the clip. I haven't used the slice curve because that's something else that I want to show you. And let's go ahead and actually do that. Let's go back to this mesh that was used as the dummy mesh. So now let's go ahead and use the trim brush. And I'm going to cut through here roughly, right? So I just trimmed that area, right? ZBrush deleted all these polygons and filled in these gaps. And now let's go ahead and do the same thing for the bottom. So Control Shift, actually let's go ahead and I'm going to enable everything so that I can see roughly when I'm creating the slice. So somewhere around there. Okay, let's go back to solo mode. And we basically, from the body that we originally had, the duplicate, we created this mesh. So now that we have this, we can use some of the processes that we already use, like Dynamesh. So we can go ahead and click Dynamesh, and now we have even topology all around, right? Let's go into solo mode. Let's get out of solo mode actually. And obviously this is in the same space as the body because, it is essentially a piece of the body, right? So again, we can use some of the features that we already use. So in this case, I can use inflate to just give it a bit more volume. Not too much, just a tiny bit so that it looks like it has thickness, right? And then we can go ahead and start using the move brushes like we already used, to adjust the shape. So I'm going to go into solo mode, right click to increase my brush size, make sure I have symmetry enabled. And this one doesn't have a clear center line, so we can go ahead and mirror and well. So now we have a perfect line in the middle. And we can start giving these pants kind of like a more of a baggy shape, right? Not necessarily sculpting details or anything like that just yet. We're going to get to that later on. We just need to create the asset or the volume so that we can then work on that. I want to actually smooth this area a tiny bit more. Just using the shift key to smooth it. And maybe just bring these two closer together, these two areas here. And this is just a quick pass, right? We're going to actually spend a bit more time here refining the pants. All right, and I'm gonna do a smoothing as well here. Get out of polyframe and solo. And now with the rest of the mesh together, or the rest of the body, I can just do tiny tweaks or tiny refinements to fix that. And now, of course, these pieces are sort of overlapping, so we're going to get to the adjustment part later on, but very quickly we can select this one, bring in the gizmo, and then just fine-tune it a tiny bit. All of these small pieces or all of these small intersections are going to be something that we are going to fine-tune later when we get to adjusting these shapes. Again, this is kind of like a secondary pass on blocking the assets, but it's always good to be able to see the silhouette properly and the volumes. So just a tiny bit of adjustments here, nothing too crazy. All right, and that's just another way that we can generate meshes from existing meshes, right? Using these clip brushes and Dynamesh and Inflate and all that. Okay, so that's it for the pants. Let's go ahead and do the other piece, the one that I mentioned for this area, which I'm going to use to introduce you to this slice curve. So let's go ahead and select this piece, the one in front, this piece of the skirt. I'm going to solo mode, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it again. So I'm going to duplicate and use the same mesh that I had as a reference for creating the new mesh. Now, if I go with the trim curve, right, I can go ahead and start trimming this like so, right? Which is great if you want to, simplify this, right? The problem with this approach, in this case that is a single-sided polygon, remember this is just a single-sided mesh, is that the trim curve, once it has deleted the polygons, it basically fills the gaps. And because this is a single-sided polygon, it creates this weird thickness, right? Which could be a problem. So the trim curve is something that I wouldn't use in anything that is that has a single-sided polygon. So let me undo all that. So you see, this is all a single-sided polygon. And as soon as I clip, oops, let's do it again. As soon as I clip from here, then Cirrus is going to fill this area. Okay, so I will stay away from using the trim curve when you have a single-sided polygon. Now, if you use the clip brushes, it could work. However, let me do it the other way around. Remember that this is basically just clipping these points. So you end up with a very weird set of polygons here. So it's not ideal, all right? So I wouldn't use either the clip brush or the trim brush in anything that has to do with a single-sided polygon. Let me undo that. And that's when this slice curve comes in handy, because we can basically slice through the model and then get rid of whatever we don't need, all right? So essentially the slice, what it does is what the name says. I'm going to turn off symmetry. I'm going to hold Control and Shift to access it, click and drag and hold Shift, right? And as you can see, it just cuts through the model. It adds a new loop, which is great, and it creates two different polygroups. All right, so let's go ahead and undo that, because I want to do it a little bit closer to the top edge, like so. And we can do the same thing here at the bottom. Actually, let's turn everything on so that I can see what I'm doing. So it's going to be around this area, maybe a little bit lower, right? And then we can do the same thing here for the side. Something like that. All right. So as you can see, every slice or every time that the curve goes through the mesh, it's going to create that loop, slicing essentially through the model, and every new piece or the difference between the slice is going to create a new polygroup. So this is another great example of why polygroups are so useful. So before I go ahead and use the polygroups, I'm going to go ahead and mirror and well, so that I have exactly the same polygroups in one side. So using the mirror and well in this case is going to take this, obviously this is the center line, it's going to put this one in here as well, this one in here, and this one as well in there, right? So that's why it's very useful at this stage. So mirror and well, now we have still a single-sided polygon, but we sliced it into different parts. Now, from this slicing, all we really care about is this piece, which is the straight rectangular piece. Okay, any of these pieces, we're gonna get rid of that, because really this is the only piece that we need, and this is the perfect size for this area, right? The rest we don't need. So that's when we can use the delete hidden. So I'm going to go ahead and select the select lasso, right? So Control and Shift to access that, and I'm going to click on this centerpiece. So because we had the polygroups, Sirius is going to select only the one that we clicked on, and the rest are going to be hidden. Again, this is a quick recap, so Control Shift, click and drag to invert that selection, right? But we only want to remove the ones that are hidden. So with this hidden, I can just go to this delete hidden, click it once, and now there is nothing in there. So we just simplify this quite a bit, but we got this very nice set of edges with this slice curve. This is still not a great topology in terms of flow, but we're gonna get to that later on. Now, a couple of things just to wrap up this video, because we have already done everything that I wanted to do in this video. Let's actually move this forward a little bit. We can center that pivot so that we can arrange this piece a little bit better. And if you feel that maybe it is too thick or too thin, you can just adjust it with the gizmo very quickly. But for the most part, we have created the pieces and the assets for this video. All right, so just to wrap it up, I'm going to show you where the delete hidden button is, and also why I added these close holes. So the delete hidden is under the geometry palette and in the section called modify topology. So this is something that we have already explored a little bit. So this modify topology section of the geometry palette, right? Because here is where we grabbed the mirror and well button that we put in here, and it's essentially modifying the topology. That's why it is within this palette. And then we now have this delete hidden, right? This palette is incredibly useful, especially this section. And then we also have these close holes, which is this one here, and I'm going to explain what this does and why I added to the UI, and why it's kind of like close to Dynamesh or related to Dynamesh. So in terms of the progress for our character, we are done. We basically can save this as a new tool, as a new iteration of the tool. So you can basically stop following along at this point. I'm just going to give you an example of these close holes. So I'm going to select a new sphere, make it a Polymesh 3D, and I'm going to go ahead and hold Control and Shift to access the select rectangular brush. I'm going to hide these areas, also press V to be able to see it, right? And I'm going to go ahead and click delete hidden, right? So I basically use the select rectangular brush to hide one part of this, or one portion of this sphere, and delete everything. So now we have a single-sided polygon, like an open geometry, with this hole in here. But if I click these close holes, ZBrush is going to analyze this volume, and it's going to create this new geometry to fill in these gaps, right? So this is really useful, because now we can continue working with a solid piece or a solid mesh. Now another example of how useful this could be is if let's use the select lasso. Let's go ahead and select something like this, hold the Alt key without letting go of the click, just to invert that selection, and let's go ahead and delete that, delete those polygons, and let's close holes. All right, so this one, it looks very familiar to the process of using the trim curve, right? That we use kind of like a curve, and it just generates this. So really what ZBrush is doing when you use the trim brushes is slice through the model, removing parts, and then fill it. So I'm going to do it manually, just so that you understand what's happening. So it will, using the trim curve, is basically using the slice curve, like so, right? To create that line, or to slice through the model. then ZBrush is automatically hiding the pieces that you don't need, right? So these pieces that I want to remove, and I'm going to delete that, and then it's filling those holes. So as you can see, this is the manual process of what the trim curve is doing. So if I use the trim curve and do that, it's all part of the same. So it's doing the same process, but simplified. Okay, and that's kind of like what's important to know about these close holes. It's very, very useful. Now, if I go back in time to what I had before at the beginning, right, an open geometry. If I Dynamesh this, Dynamesh is going to take anything that is an open geometry and is going to fill it. And this is a very important concept of Dynamesh that I didn't mention until now. So if I Dynamesh this, although this was a single-sided polygon, Dynamesh basically filled in these areas, right? So in this example, you can decide whether you want to go with Dynamesh, or if I undo that, you can also go by closing holes and then Dynameshing, so you have even topology, or simply just leave it as it is, and then you can start, smoothing these areas and working like so. Okay, so very, very useful stuff. So the close holes is an extra tool that you can use during this process in certain areas. All right, so that basically covers the trim, the slice, the clip brushes, as well as the generation of new meshes or new assets from existing ones. So again, I want to reiterate the fact that having a blockout that works and the silhouette and the proportions right from the beginning is crucial for the next stage of creating the details and the assets. So if you spend a lot of time in that stage of blocking out the character, making sure that the proportions and the distance between one limb and the other and the silhouette is working, is actually a good sign that you're focusing on those primary shapes before we move forward, and that will become more evident later on as we progress in the course. So I'm going to leave this lesson here, and in the next video I'm going to cover a new set of tools to create things like the straps and tubes and that sort of thing, which is really, really cool and another powerful tool inside ZBrush. So I'll see you there.